Well, my wife's vegetable garden is in. Things are looking good. We'll get a lot of really good food out of this garden. But it doesn't happen by her just poking a few holes and planting a few seeds. Her success is increased exponentially by one thing: she has a plan. Well, hello, minders. Welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. And yes, we are talking about planning in watercolor. Now, I don't want to kind of approach this subject in the dry, dusty way that usually gets approached. No offense to any other watercolorists out there. No, there are a lot of important things in planning, but most of them are common to all media. So I'm not going to touch on those. You want to choose your subject. You want to draw it out, become familiar with it, be interested in your subject, do something that you feel comfortable drawing, pick the colors. All of that is true no matter what you're painting with: oils, colored pencil, acrylics, pastels. All of that is part of just about any realistic art project. Now, what I want to talk about is media planning, and that is the process is unique to watercolor, and this is the area that most artists, watercolorists, beginners, I should say, those still learning, fail to plan at. Now, before I do that, though, I want to just tell you what I'm doing here. So I'm in my Perfect Sketchbook signature series, so that means Fabriano Artistico paper. I've just taped off a little section. I really wanted to paint a cluster of tree trunks, maybe with some roots. Surprise, surprise. I really, really wanted to do something sort of dark, foresty, and moody, semi-spontaneous, but I really wanted to get in there and get dark. And because it's spontaneous, I can't really mask off any highlights. I'm going to have to put those in later, so that means adding them with gouache. So already you're getting a little bit of a clue into my planning process. And this is what I want to talk about. You can see, by the way, down here at the bottom, where I'm hoping some roots will sort of materialize spontaneously. I've sprayed with a spray bottle, and I'm letting the water just kind of create some little root shapes. So some planned, some spontaneous, and we're just going to see what happens. Okay, so what do I mean by a media plan? And that's my own words. I didn't find that anywhere. It's not an official term, but you need to know what watercolor does. And you need to know your paints, your brushes, your paper, and have a pretty good idea what sort of process or order you want to do things in. Now, depending on the colors, what colors are you going to put down first? Usually with watercolor, you go light to dark. Or are you going to layer? We're going to put down light layers, let them dry, come back, put heavier layers, work gradually, layer by layer, down into the shadows. It's a very good, valid way. It's a more controlled way of doing watercolor. But you really need to know if this is what you're going to do. Or are you going to let it be free and loose? Are you going to completely wet the paper and go for a wet and wet look? Let everything be soft. And you can do that regardless of whether you've drawn this out really tightly or whether you're doing something very loose and spontaneous. So what order are you going to put the colors in? What kind of layering are you going to do? And as I mentioned, choosing colors is a process that all artists need to do, but with watercoloring specifically, you need to know how those colors are going to interact. What's your mixing strategy going to be? Are you going to pre-mix some pools, or are you just going to put down bright colors and let them mix on the paper? These are the more unique to watercolor kind of questions that you really kind of need to answer. Now back to my process. Again, I wanted a dark scene. At least I knew I wanted the subject to be dark. So I've got that laid in as sort of a base. It's fairly loose. What you see me doing here is lifting. And I thought I would sort of hint at where the highlights need to go by doing a little bit of lifting. Now that really doesn't get the job done totally, but at least it lightens that area and I'm less likely to lift a lot of that paint. So again, I'm thinking through the media. I'm thinking how the media is going to react. And you can see I'm creating a little bit of form. You're starting to see these tree trunks emerge and materialize. And this will be enhanced with the gouache. By the way, just a side note, I'm using these Etcher gouache brushes. They have two sets now. They have a regular sort of all-purpose set, and then they have this set they call their gouache set. I've never used them before. I have to admit, I was really impressed with them. They were a joy to use. But so I wanted to use those. I've had them sitting around for months and not used them. All right, so now we're getting into the gouache, and I'm just pre-spraying it to wet it. I'm still trying to use up this Daniel Smith gouache from months ago from the review. Can't bear to throw it away. And we're going to mix up basically some warm light tones for highlights. Now, again, the media planning is really, don't let that just throw you for a loop. You need to know your medium. You need to know how it reacts. And this is the reason I advocate doing things like spontaneous painting or studies, because it's not just the subject that you're needing to get to know. It's not just the subject that's important. It's not just the colors. In fact, it rarely is mainly the colors. It's knowing what's going to happen roughly when you put the paint and the water down on the paper. That's where spontaneous painting came in. For me, I spent a lot of time working with spontaneous painting, so I didn't have to plan, but I could just learn from the medium itself. Then when I go to a more planned painting, or I need to know what the watercolor medium, the paint, the water, all of that is going to do, I have a better idea. That's why I advocate studies so much. They're explorations. Then you get to know how different media interact. Get a better idea of what order to put things down in, what colors you don't want to put in last because they're not going to show up. How much time you need to spend working out where the highlights are going to be. Do I need to mask for those highlights? Do I need to plan for painting around them, which usually requires some drawing? I don't want to throw you for a loop on this. It's really not all that complicated. It's a matter of thinking through the process. What I do usually is sort of a mental dress rehearsal. I'll sit down before I start a subject, especially if I want it to be more of a finished painting. And I'll just think, what am I going to do first? When I get to those edges and the edges are starting to dry, am I going to, by hand, blend out each edge with a brush and some water? Am I going to pull out a spray bottle? What am I going to do? Am I going to pre-wet particular areas of the painting first so that when I put down the paint, it's a soft blend? Or am I just going to go ahead and paint hard edges? Here I'm adding some shadows. I've already added some highlights. I'm going back in and deepening shadows. And what I'm doing is I'm just simply going back in with my brush, getting some water and blending out any edges that I don't want to be hard. Media planning with watercolor is simply having an action and a reaction in every situation. You won't always be perfect at it, especially if you're a beginner. But the less you plan, the more difficult it's going to be to have a successful painting. With watercolor, you really can't just sit down and start painting and just hope it turns out right. This is why so many watercolorists talk about planning and how important that is in watercolor. The thing I don't hear many watercolorists talk about, though, is how much time you need to spend planning what the medium will do and how you will handle it. Just to kind of repeat what I said at the beginning, you hear a lot about the drawing and the preparing and the picking the subject and picking the colors. All that's well and fine. But your greatest success with watercolor is going to come from planning the process of applying the media and how you're going to do that. Even this here is a study But it's a process that I'm sort of kind of honing and whittling because I want to do a fuller, bigger painting with this sort of process. Watercolor does a better job. Transparent watercolor does a better job with the darks. I don't think this is anything I've ever talked about before. Gouache does a better job with the highlights, of course. Transparent watercolor doesn't handle highlights at all. But if you need to paint in highlights, then gouache is the alternative. You could use acrylic also. But I really don't care for the darks in gouache because they look dead flat and chalky. So that was a big part of my planning and my process of thinking how I was going to do this. And I think it worked out well. It's a process that I'm going to repeat. And the next time I do this, I'm going to have a little more information and my planning is going to be a little more successful. I have given myself confidence. I appreciate you all watching. If you want to see another video similar to this, here it is. Thank you so much, patrons, for your support of this channel. See everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.